Every year, roughly 1.5 million crocodiles and alligators are killed for their skin, slaughtered specifically to become handbags, belts, and watch straps for a luxury fashion industry that treats a single crocodile skin purse as a 5- or 6-figure investment. That number alone sounds like exactly the kind of story that ends with a species vanishing, the way so many other stories about hunting a wild animal for profit have ended before. 60 years ago, in fact, it very nearly did. American alligators hunted to the edge of extinction across the southern United States. Wild crocodile populations across Africa and Southeast Asia collapsing under exactly the same unregulated hunting pressure, chasing exactly the same skins that fashion houses wanted more of every year, with no limit, no quota, and no plan for what happened when the wild animals simply ran out. And then something happened that almost nobody would have predicted. The industry that was killing these animals became the reason most of them are still here at all. This is the story of how farming millions of one of the world's most feared predators, on purpose, for profit, may have done more to save it from extinction than any conservation campaign ever could, and why the same industry is still fighting one of its oldest and least comfortable arguments today. Start with the raw numbers. Roughly 1.5 million crocodilian skins move through the global market every single year, essentially one skin per animal, since each crocodile only has one. The industry behind that number was valued at $6.3 billion in 2023, and it's projected to nearly triple to $19.2 billion by 2033. Australia alone supplies almost 60% of every saltwater crocodile skin traded internationally, anchored by farms in the Northern Territory, generating roughly $107 million a year. Across Africa, South Africa exports around $70 million of crocodile product annually. Zambia and Kenya each bring in more than $60 million. Zimbabwe adds another $30+ million on top of that. In the United States, Louisiana alone farms around 400,000 American alligators a year, with farm skins valued at more than $56 million in 2024. 4 species carry almost the entire weight of this industry, and each one comes from a completely different part of the world. The saltwater crocodile, small, fine-scaled, and the most valuable skin of the 4, is farmed across Australia, Southeast Asia, and Papua New Guinea. The Nile crocodile, larger-scaled and more rugged, is farmed mainly across South Africa, Zimbabwe, and Kenya. The American alligator, prized for a belly skin that's naturally free of bony scutes and unusually smooth, comes almost entirely out of the southern United States. And the Siamese crocodile, the most common crocodile leather on mid-tier goods, is farmed across Thailand, Vietnam, and Cambodia. The single largest farm on the planet, Thailand's Samut Prakan crocodile farm, houses somewhere between 60,000 and well over 100,000 animals, depending on which count you trust. Either way, a single facility holding more crocodiles than most cities have people willing to live near one. The operations themselves are spread across a surprising number of countries. CITES registries list 28 commercial Siamese crocodile farming operations in Thailand alone, 21 in Cambodia, and 10 in Vietnam, alongside 13 known farms in Australia and 7 registered in Malaysia. And that count is only for facilities formally registered to farm one particular species, not the full global picture across all 4. South Africa alone is estimated to have somewhere between 60 and over 80 commercial crocodile operations of its own, organized under an industry body, the South Africa Crocodile Industry Association, that publishes its own national standards for ethical production. Proof that even the count of farms, country by country, is still an estimate rather than a precise census. Behind almost every one of these animals sits the same customer. Exotic skins, crocodile chief among them, made up somewhere between 5 and 10% of all leather goods sold worldwide in 2021. A small share of total volume that carries an outsized share of total value. A single crocodile skin Birkin bag from Hermès has retailed above £50,000, around €44,000, and routinely resells above that price on the secondary market. Louis Vuitton's exotic handbags run up to £30,000. This is not a niche curiosity sitting at the edge of the fashion industry. It is one of the most consistently profitable product categories a handful of the world's biggest luxury houses make. 60 years ago, none of this scale existed because the raw material was disappearing. By the 1960s, unregulated hunting had pushed the American alligator to the edge of extinction across the southern United States. Wild populations gutted by decades of open hunting for exactly the skins the fashion world wanted more of. Across Africa and Southeast Asia, wild Nile and saltwater crocodile populations were under the same pressure, hunted faster than they could reproduce, with no quotas, no oversight, and no mechanism to stop a valuable wild animal from being hunted straight into local extinction. None of this happened in a vacuum where the animal was simply a passive victim either. Crocodilians are responsible for roughly 1,000 fatal attacks on humans worldwide every year, with sub-Saharan Africa alone recording more than 300 fatal Nile crocodile attacks annually. The same species, in many of the same regions, that farming and ranching programs were being built to protect. Anywhere people fish, bathe, or farm near crocodile habitat, coexistence was never a purely sentimental proposition. That made the eventual solution even more counterintuitive. The answer to protecting a population that was actively, sometimes fatally, dangerous to the people living alongside it, turned out to be making that population more valuable alive than dead, not simply declaring it off limits and hoping the conflict resolved itself. That created a genuine crisis with two seemingly incompatible sides. On one side, a growing global demand for crocodile leather that showed every sign of expanding further. Fashion houses wanted more skins every year as international trade and luxury markets both grew. On the other side, a wild resource that, left alone, was mathematically headed toward disappearing entirely, taking the entire supply chain down with it. Ban the trade outright, and you remove the immediate hunting pressure, but you also remove any economic reason for anyone, governments, local communities, hunters, to protect a large, dangerous, expensive to coexist with predator instead of quietly eliminating it as a nuisance. Let the trade continue unregulated, and the species disappears anyway, just more slowly. Neither option actually solved the underlying problem. How do you keep a genuinely profitable, genuinely deadly predator both alive in the wild and available to a fashion industry that wanted to keep using it? Every government that tried to answer that question in the 1960s and 1970s was, in effect, choosing between two different ways of losing. The first pieces of an answer had already started appearing before anyone coordinated them into a system. In 1945, in Singapore, the Tan Mo Hong reptile skin and Singapore crocodile farm opened as one of the earliest commercial crocodile operations anywhere, part of Singapore's rise as a post-war hub for the skin trade. 5 years later, in 1950, a Thai entrepreneur named U Thai Young Prapakorn founded what would become Samut Prakan Crocodile Farm outside Bangkok, with two goals that most people would assume contradict each other: preserving rare and endangered reptile species and building a commercial business selling crocodile leather goods. U Thai spent the following decades doing both at once, turning his farm into a world-famous tourist attraction, complete with crocodile wrestling shows and trained animal performances that funded the breeding and preservation side of the operation. By the time he died at 96, his farm had grown into the largest crocodile operation on the planet, holding tens of thousands of animals, proof that conservation and commercial exploitation were not necessarily opposites, just two labels for the same underlying bet. In the United States, as wild alligator populations kept collapsing through the 1960s, commercial farms began appearing specifically to take pressure off the wild population, combining wild egg collection with on-site breeding. And in 1965, on the shores of Lake Kariba in what is now Zimbabwe, the Kariba Crocodile Farm opened as the country's first commercial crocodile venture, a small, family-run operation that would eventually grow into part of Padenga Holdings, one of Africa's largest crocodile producers. Notice what these four founding stories have in common. None of them coordinated with each other. A Singaporean businessman, a Thai zoo owner with a conservation streak, an American state wrestling with collapsing wetland wildlife, and a family in newly independent Zimbabwe all arrived at roughly the same answer: breed the animal deliberately, on purpose, at scale, without a shared blueprint or a single inventor to credit. That is often how these turning points actually happen. Several unconnected people, working independently, arriving at the same conclusion that farming was less risky than continuing to hunt. None of these farms, on their own, solved the deeper regulatory problem. That took an international framework. In 1985, at the Fifth Conference of the Parties to CITES, the international treaty governing trade in endangered species, held in Buenos Aires, member states adopted something genuinely new: a quota system that allowed certain crocodilian populations, originally listed under the treaty's strictest protection category since 1979, to be shifted toward a regulated, quota-based trade instead. Indonesia's saltwater crocodile population moved under this system with an initial annual export quota of just 2,000 specimens. 9 African nations' Nile crocodile populations, including Tanzania's, transferred at that same meeting. Australia had already begun its own version 2 years earlier, in 1983, introducing regulated wild egg harvesting under a government program that adjusted its quotas as population surveys tracked the wild population's recovery. The insight underneath all of it was the same: whichever country implemented it first, instead of banning the trade and hoping poachers respected the ban, give farms and local communities a direct financial stake in the health of the wild population itself. In Kenya's Tana River ranching program, that idea became a specific, enforceable rule. Companies harvesting wild eggs are required to release at least 4% of the crocodiles they hatch back into the wild river system, structured so that more hatchlings return to the ecosystem than would have naturally survived from those same eggs on their own. Farming, ranching, and regulated quotas turned a wild crocodile from a liability worth eliminating into an asset worth protecting. None of this convinced everyone, and the doubts that remain are not the kind that resolve neatly. The clearest data point in the industry's favor is the American alligator. Hunted nearly to extinction by the 1960s, it was formally delisted from the U.S. endangered species list in 1987, and it's now rated least concern by conservation authorities. In Louisiana alone, the wild population climbed from fewer than 100,000 animals to more than 3 million over the following 5 decades. A recovery so complete that the state now runs a dedicated nuisance alligator control program, removing more than 1,000 animals a year from backyards, drainage canals, and golf courses, and still issues thousands of recreational hunting tags every season without denting the overall population. A species that once needed active protection from disappearing now needs active management to keep it from being everywhere. Similar recovery patterns have been documented in Australia, Kenya, and Zimbabwe, where regulated crocodile trade correlates with wild population increases, and ranching programs in Kenya and Zimbabwe specifically are credited with reducing poaching pressure on other species sharing the same habitat. But animal welfare groups have never accepted that the conservation outcome settles the argument, and their criticism is specific, current, ongoing, and grounded in documented investigation rather than general activism. In 2016, PETA Asia investigators filmed conditions inside Vietnamese crocodile farms, supplying skins into LVMH's fashion supply chain. Animals held in bare concrete enclosures narrower than the length of their own bodies for roughly 15 months before slaughter, and a killing method that involved cutting into the animals' necks and ramming a metal rod down the spinal column. An independent reptile veterinarian who reviewed the footage concluded the neck incisions were acutely painful and that the animals were very unlikely to have died instantly. Crocodilian nervous systems, the vet noted, can retain some function for over an hour after the spinal cord is severed. Vietnam alone exports roughly 30,000 crocodile skins a year through this supply chain. This is a separate investigation, at separate farms, describing a different and much rougher method than the earlier captive bolt studies entirely, which is itself part of the point. The industry is not one uniform, evenly regulated system. Standards vary enormously by country and by farm. In Australia specifically, the welfare codes of practice that farms are supposed to follow are not legally binding, because farmed animals are exempted from the country's own Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act, meaning the standards that exist are voluntary industry guidance, not enforceable law. The industry's counter-argument is its own body of research. Peer-reviewed studies on saltwater crocodile slaughter, using a penetrative captive bolt device following electrical stunning, have measured brain activity directly with EEG monitoring and found immediate, irreversible loss of consciousness in every single animal tested. That is a genuinely rigorous, independently verifiable result. And animal welfare organizations still maintain that electrical stunning is not an acceptable method for killing reptiles at all, regardless of what a captive bolt device does afterward. Both claims are backed by real research. They simply don't agree with each other. Critics go further still, arguing that CITES reclassifying crocodilians from the treaty's strictest protection category to a regulated trade category mostly served commercial interests, dressed up in conservation language to justify continuing to kill animals for fashion. The legal, regulated system also has documented enforcement gaps at its most visible end. In 2024, celebrity handbag designer Nancy Gonzalez, whose crocodile and python skin bags had appeared on Sex and the City and been carried by clients including Victoria Beckham, was sentenced to 18 months in a U.S. federal prison for running a multi-year scheme that smuggled an estimated $2 million of unauthorized exotic skin handbags into the country, recruiting couriers to carry them past customs on commercial flights without the import permits U.S. wildlife law requires. It is a reminder that even a fully legal, quota-regulated, internationally monitored supply chain still depends on individual actors following paperwork rules that are, in practice, easy to skip. Both of these things are true at the same time, and the industry has never fully reconciled them. The population recovery numbers are real. The welfare criticism is also real, and it is not going away. This industry has learned to operate alongside that tension. An animal can be both a conservation success story and a subject of legitimate, ongoing welfare concern, rather than resolve it. Whatever position you take on the ethics, the mechanics of turning a live crocodile into a luxury handbag follow a remarkably consistent sequence across every species and every country. It starts with eggs. In ranching operations, wild eggs are collected during the breeding season, commonly February and March in several regions, then moved to artificial incubators, where controlled temperature and humidity produce a far higher hatch survival rate than the eggs would achieve left in a wild nest exposed to flooding, predation, and temperature swings. Temperature during those incubators does more than just protect the eggs. It determines the sex of every hatchling inside them. Crocodilian eggs follow what researchers call a female-male-female pattern. Cooler incubation temperatures produce females, a narrow intermediate band produces males, and warmer temperatures swing back to females again. In Nile crocodiles, that male-producing window sits roughly between 31 and 34 degrees Celsius, and the whole determination happens during a critical window between roughly the 7th and 21st day of incubation. Farms that need a specific sex ratio for breeding stock or growth rates aren't guessing. They're managing the literal temperature of a room. From there, hatchlings are raised specifically toward a target size, not simply to adulthood. A standard 40-centimeter belly skin panel, the size most commonly needed for a handbag, typically comes from a crocodile around 1.2 meters long, roughly a year and a half old. That target size, not the animal's natural lifespan, dictates the entire growth phase. Feeding follows an equally deliberate curve. Hatchlings in their first year are fed roughly 25% of their own body weight in food every week, mostly fish, poultry, or a mixed protein diet running around 45% protein. An enormous appetite that gradually tapers to around 18% of body weight per week by the third year, as growth itself slows and the animal approaches its target slaughter size. At target size, animals are slaughtered and skinned, and the raw skin is shipped to specialist tanneries, a separate, highly specific industry in its own right, since crocodile skin's scale pattern requires different tanning chemistry and handling than cattle or sheep leather. The tanning sequence itself runs through a fixed chemical order regardless of species: soaking to rehydrate the raw skin, liming to loosen hair and residue, deliming and enzyme baiting to clean the surface, then a sulfuric acid and salt pickling bath that stabilizes the hide before it can be tanned at all. The actual tanning step splits into two traditions: chrome tanning, using chromium salts for a faster, softer, more flexible result, or vegetable tanning, using natural plant tannins for a firmer, richer colored leather. before the skin is stretched, dried, and dyed to the exact shade a fashion house has specified. From the tannery, finished skins go to the luxury houses themselves or their contracted leather goods manufacturers, where a single skin is cut and matched by hand to the precise scale pattern the finished product needs. No two skins pattern exactly alike, which is part of why an exotic leather handbag costs what it does. Meat is the industry's secondary product, and it has always run a distant second to skin in both volume and value. Historically, international crocodile meat trade totaled only around 400 tons a year between 1990 and 2005, sourced mostly from Siamese and Nile crocodiles and American alligators, modest numbers next to the skin trade's millions of animals. Pricing reflects that secondary status. Crocodile meat sells for around 300 baht per kilogram in Thailand, and for as little as 75 cents to $1.50 per kilogram in Cambodia, a fraction of what the same animal's skin is worth. But the meat side is growing. In 2023, Vietnam approved commercial crocodile meat exports for the first time, opening new trade routes into China and South Korea. Evidence that an industry built almost entirely around skin is starting to take its other major product more seriously. At the top of the value chain, this industry is inseparable from a handful of the most recognizable names in luxury fashion. Hermès sources its porosus skins, saltwater crocodile, mainly from Australia, and its Niloticus skins, Nile crocodile, mainly from Zimbabwe, treating the species and country of origin as a meaningful quality distinction the way a winemaker treats a vineyard's terroir. A single company sits behind an outsized share of that Zimbabwean supply, Padenga Holdings, which operates the original Kariba farm alongside two others, accounts for roughly 85% of the entire global supply of Nile crocodile skins used in high-end fashion. Padenga has been a publicly traded company since November 2010, when it listed on the Zimbabwe Stock Exchange as the first company anywhere in Africa built solely around crocodile skin and meat production, meaning anyone can, in principle, buy a stake in the industry supplying Hermès simply by buying its stock. A crocodile skin Birkin bag has retailed above £50,000 and consistently resells above that price on the secondary market, one of the few consumer products anywhere that reliably appreciates the moment it leaves the store. Louis Vuitton and Gucci both build exotic leather lines around the same handful of species, with Louis Vuitton's exotic handbags retailing up to £30,000. That supply chain is not immune to ordinary agricultural risk either. One South African farm supplying Gucci's leather goods was reported to have been hurt badly by drought, a reminder that a crocodile is still a farmed animal, dependent on water and feed inputs like any other livestock, luxury price tag notwithstanding. Even watchmaking leans on the same supply chain. Rolex has long offered crocodile leather straps on flagship models like the Daytona, Skydweller, and Day-Date, extending the same four farm species from handbags onto wrists. The trade routes underneath all of this follow the money in a very specific direction. Finished skins move mainly to France, Singapore, Japan, and Italy, the countries with the tanneries and ateliers that turn raw hide into finished handbags. Meat moves in almost the opposite direction, toward Hong Kong, China, and Belgium, markets willing to pay for a product the fashion capitals mostly ignore. That luxury fashion demand is what makes the entire conservation mechanism financially possible in the first place. Without a fashion industry willing to pay tens of thousands of dollars for a single bag, none of the quota systems, ranching programs, or population recovery numbers from the turning point section would have an economic engine behind them. Meat exports, cosmetics-adjacent byproducts, and tourism built around visiting the farms themselves all add smaller revenue streams on top. But skin, specifically, skin destined for a small number of extremely expensive fashion brands, is still what makes the entire system run. None of that demand is guaranteed to keep growing forever either. A Singapore-based startup called Project X is developing lab-cultivated crocodile skin alternatives, part of a wider wave of biofabricated and mushroom-based leathers that luxury brands have started experimenting with. The broader luxury vegan leather market was valued at roughly $1.9 billion in 2024 and is projected to more than double to $4.5 billion by 2031. Market forecasts for the exotic leather segment specifically are, tellingly, far less consistent than the farming industry figures cited earlier in this video. One analysis puts the international exotic leather market at around $830 million in 2025, actually shrinking toward roughly $581 million by 2035 as ethical concerns, tightening regulation, and synthetic competition all apply pressure at once. Two different sets of analysts, looking at overlapping parts of the same industry, are currently telling two different stories about where this is headed. Run the numbers from every angle, and the same pattern holds. An American alligator population hunted to the edge of extinction in the 1960s is now rated least concern, farmed at a scale of around 400,000 animals a year in Louisiana alone. A global industry that didn't meaningfully exist as a regulated system before 1985 is now worth $6.3 billion, on its way to nearly triple that within a decade. A single Hermès handbag, built from the skin of one farmed crocodile, sells for more than most people earn in a year. And the farm that supplied that skin operates under a quota system explicitly designed to keep the wild population of that same species growing, not shrinking. Zoom out to the country level, and the pattern holds there too. Louisiana's wild alligator population, once collapsing toward local extinction, now sits above 3 million animals, large enough that the state's bigger management headache is now removing 1,000+ nuisance alligators a year from people's backyards, not trying to find the last few survivors. Zimbabwe's Padenga Holdings alone supplies an estimated 85% of the world's Nile crocodile skins, runs as a fully public company on a stock exchange, and still traces its lineage back to one small family farm opened on the shores of Lake Kariba in 1965. Thailand's Samut Prakan farm, founded the same decade the American alligator was nearly wiped out, is simultaneously the largest crocodile farm on the planet and one of the country's most visited tourist attractions. The same operation preserving rare species and selling their skins, exactly as its founder intended from day one. Just the 5 countries with published CITES registries in this video: Thailand, Cambodia, Vietnam, Australia, and Malaysia, account for nearly 80 separate commercial farming operations between them, and that is before counting Zimbabwe, South Africa, Kenya, Zambia, and the United States, none of which were included in that particular count. The genuinely strange part is that almost none of these operations exist because someone wanted to run a factory farm for its own sake. Every one of them exists because, at some point, a government, a company, or a family decided that the fastest way to stop a valuable predator from disappearing was to put a price on keeping it alive. None of this erases the welfare argument. The pits, the cages, the slaughter methods that animal rights groups have documented are not hypothetical, and no amount of population recovery data makes a cramped concrete enclosure a non-issue. But the conservation numbers are also not hypothetical. A species that was disappearing now isn't. That is the genuinely uncomfortable truth sitting at the center of this entire industry. The same system responsible for killing 1.5 million crocodiles a year is also, by the best available evidence, the reason several of the species involved still exist in meaningful numbers in the wild at all. Most conservation stories want you to root for a straightforward hero, a scientist, an activist, a piece of clever technology. This one doesn't offer that. The hero of the American alligator's recovery, and the Nile crocodiles, and the saltwater crocodiles, is a quota system built specifically to let a fashion industry keep killing the animal, on the theory that a species worth farming is a species worth protecting from anyone who isn't farming it legally. It worked, by the numbers that matter most to a conservation biologist. It also produced a factory farming system that welfare advocates have spent decades documenting and criticizing, with no sign either side is about to concede the argument. And the industry built on top of that uneasy compromise is not guaranteed to look the same in another 60 years. A lab in Singapore is already growing crocodile skin alternatives without a single live animal involved. A wider vegan leather market is doubling every few years, and at least one set of market analysts thinks the exotic leather segment itself is heading into a slow decline, squeezed by exactly the ethical scrutiny this episode has spent the last several minutes documenting. The species that farming arguably saved may end up needing that same industry far less than it does today, because the fashion math, not the conservation math, is the piece most likely to stop working first. The most effective solution to an extinction crisis is often the one that feels the least comfortable, the one that changes the economic math for everyone involved, for as long as that math keeps adding up. If you want more stories like this one, where the real answer to how an industry works turns out to be more complicated than either side wants to admit, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what happens when the next unlikely industry gets the same close look.